information of his amazing career, he was a journalist before. The commonality that Dan and Jim shared together today. Now, I want to tell you that today's session is all about his possibly not necessarily known career that he has been devoted to. That is his dedication and commitment to sustainable development, sustainability, and the linkage between trade and environment, mostly possibly known for the spirit of this organization's preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement. For the next 75 minutes, we are going to dive into some of his anecdotes and experiences and knowledge. Now, Dan, it's also very hard to introduce you, Dan. Our discussant of today, he's our spokesperson of this organization. I must read up this part, actually. Before joining the WTO in 2014, Dan spent a quarter of a century working as a journalist, mainly with the US-based Bureau of National... interviewing you, which later became Bloomberg BNA. You were a journalist in very different parts of the world, in Asia, obviously in US, and now in Geneva. So I'm really honored to have very distinguished figures today with us. And before maybe diving into the book, as a moderator, I wanted to pose a very general question to you, Professor Jim. You were a founding member of this appellate body of this organization and two-time chairman of the appellate body that goes way back 1995 to 2003. So I was wondering what would be the kind of takeaway for you, the different dynamism maybe we had back then and now. And hopefully this is a positive tone that we can set before going into the book.
Thank you, June Young, and let me say at the outset that she has a book coming out next spring from Brill entitled Trade and Culture. The foreword is to be written by a very distinguished American former jurist with the WTO, and I'm looking forward to writing that. But in all sincerity, let me acknowledge the presence, before I say anything else, of two of my successors on the appellate body. Merit Jeno is here, and so too is Jennifer Hillman, two of my dear friends that I admire greatly. As I said, they were my successors, so I did not get to serve alongside them, but I know what they did, and what they did was serve the entire world in a fair and impartial and independent way, which is also what I tried to do on the appellate body. In terms of the spirit of the times, I was present at the creation, and I was among many, many people throughout the world who were engaged in the creation. I had been a member of the House of Representatives in the United States, and although I was a junior member of the Congress, I had previously been at USTR. I had served as a trade negotiator for the United States, and no one else in the House had done that. So I was engaged in trying to advance the trade agenda of the United States. And at the top of that agenda at the time was the need to conclude the Uruguay round and implement the legislation required by the United States to comply with its new WTO obligation. So I was one of the 6 original co-sponsors in the House of the implementing legislation. And then a year later, I was, to my surprise, nominated for the appellate body, and to my even greater surprise, I was selected. And I had the privilege of serving here for nearly a decade with some very distinguished judges from all over the world. That was an exciting time because we were present at the creation. And a point I want to underline here is that this was not only a time of the creation of the World Trade Organization. Simultaneously, it was a time of the creation of much that's of foundational significance in sustainable development and in addressing climate change as a part of pursuing and advancing sustainable development. Many of the same people who were involved in creating the WTO were at the same time involved in the Earth Summit of 1992 in Rio. I was one of them. In addition to my work on trade, I was on the House Science Committee, so I worked with many other people on what we know now as the Rio Declaration, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which sadly my own country has yet to ratify, and other initiatives there in Rio that are much of the framework we have now for pursuing sustainable development. Much of what we've accomplished since the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and more all flowed from that pivotal turning point in global history. So I get to my point that I want to make before yielding the microphone to Dan, and that is, some people say that the proposals I'm making now in my books and my pontification all over the planet are a departure from what the World Trade Organization was intended to be. I say the truth is just the opposite. I'm advocating now what I advocated then and what many other people then advocated as well. That's why in the first recital on the first page of the Marrakesh Agreement, you see the members of the WTO saying from the very beginning, and here I paraphrase, that their intention was and is to pursue trade and other economic endeavor in a way that is consistent with the objectives of sustainable development. Those words in that recital are not there by accident. They're not there as some gratuitous rhetorical flourish. That was our intent. So in trying to make that happen now, I and others who are proposing these types of improvements and modernizations in WTO rules are only pursuing the original purpose of the World Trade Organization. Now, I would argue that in the 25 and more years that have passed since we did this, that the WTO has, contrary to what many outside the trading system have alleged, not really stood in the way of sustainable development. We can argue particular cases, but by and large, I would say that, especially when you look at sustainable development broadly to include all its three pillars, not only environmentally, but socially and economically, largely the WTO has been engaged in the business of advancing sustainable development, and it has not stood in the way. But the point of my book is to say that it's not enough that the WTO not obstruct sustainable development. The WTO must be an affirmative agent for advancing climate action and other action to achieve sustainable development consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Dan, I'll stop here and let you begin with some questioning.
Thanks very much, Jim. Appreciate that. As you mentioned, you were an appellate body judge. I was a journalist at the time covering the WTO before I became the acting spokesperson. Before I jumped the fence, I was covering the World Trade Organization and the rulings of the dispute settlement system and the appellate body. So I had the great pleasure of getting to know you during that period.
Although I wouldn't tell you very much, would I?
No, you never did. None of the appellate body judges ever did, to their professional credit. Sadly for journalists, but there you go. What can you do? Jim, I haven't gone through your book entirely, but I have sampled various chapters, areas I thought that were very interesting. I think it's fair to...
You will not be on the final exam, Dan.
I will study this weekend. But one of the things that comes out of this is, it's not just a cry for action, it's a shout for action. It is that the current rules as they are not sufficient for addressing this major, major challenge of climate change. Climate change is a reality. It is now. It is happening. Action is needed. Action is needed now. That comes out clearly from your book. In regard to the WTO, you state that this organization can survive and continue to succeed only if trading links between members are revitalized and reimagined. And I was wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that, particularly in the context of this challenge of climate change.
My premise is quite simple. We do not live in a world in which the economy is over here and the environment is over there. And yet on a daily basis, in the WTO and in other international institutions and in most of the capitals of the world, we proceed from that mistaken premise. The truth of the matter is the economy's right here, and the economy is contained within the environment. This is not anything I discovered. This is something that has actually been true all along, but this is not reflected in the broader scope of international law, or in particular in international economic law, investment law, trade law. And it needs to be going forward, because it should be clear to us now. And I say this as someone from Florida, where a hurricane of more than usual intensity and scope is heading to my home in Orlando as I speak. It should be apparent to us all now that climate change is real, it's happening now, and it's accelerating, and it's linked to virtually everything in our civilization, in all that we've built mistakenly on the basis of using fossil fuels. And therefore, we need to begin looking at our rules in an entirely different way. In 1998, along with my colleagues on the appellate body, we produced a report in something that is commonly called the shrimp turtle dispute. In that report, if you haven't read it, you'll see that I'm basically paraphrasing things we said then in 1998. It is not an accident. But we also said then that in clarifying the obligations in the entirety of the WTO agreement, the contextual language in the preamble relating to sustainable development should always be considered wherever it may be relevant. It may not be relevant in a particular issue relating to import licensing, but it may be relevant as context in scrutinizing a subsidy measure. For example, we meant what we said, and I think this is true of all the existing rules. They must be seen within that particular context that's set out in the treaty. This has not always happened. But by and large, dispute settlement has, I think, shown again and again that trade will not automatically trump, a word I still use, environmental and other sustainable development considerations. What we need to do now is begin to reimagine some of these rules where they need to be revised. And we need to have additional rules that address some of the 21st century realities we have, not only in commerce, but with respect to climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, the abuse of lands, the dumping in the oceans, and so much more. And I am pleased to say, and I want to hasten to say this, that I am ever the optimist. I feel I have a duty of optimism. I'm still out here, and I'm not going away. And I want to applaud the 74 WTO members who are engaged in the structured discussions on the links between trade and environmental sustainability. They have identified half a dozen issues on which they are working that are precisely the same issues that I have recommended that WTO members address through reforms in my book. There are another dozen issues. I'd like to see them add to that list, but this is really a very positive turn of events. And I think that amid all the pessimism that we have with so much that's happening in global governance right now, this is a shining light, and we must make the most of it. I also applaud the WTO members for a number of the other initiatives they are taking in other areas of sustainable development. I would mention digital trade. I would especially want to emphasize the efforts on gender equity in trade, the effort also to address the need to link small and medium-sized enterprises more to supply chains and other aspects of trade. Many of these enterprises, I should add, are owned and run by women. And I feel the same way here as I felt when I was a child in the South in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement and was inspired to get involved in politics by this man named Martin Luther King Jr. My thought was, we've got 15% of our people that we're not using. We're not letting them have opportunities. They need equal opportunities, and then we'll all benefit from that. Well, in the case of women, it's half the people in the world. So I think the same reasoning goes. Dan, I'll stop there for now.
It's good to hear you're still an optimist, Jim, as a former appellate body judge, and I'm glad you've kept the faith. I was wondering if we could delve a little bit into the details of the book, and we're going to go into a bit of legalese here. You underline the importance of urgent action on climate change. You talk about what's possible within the WTO context. There's obviously negotiating new rules, which, as we know in the record of the World Trade Organization, is not perhaps the quickest way to get things done here. You also talk about perhaps having to rely on dispute settlement to resolve some of these issues, the interchange between trade and the environment, and what members can do to address climate change, but that has its issues as well. As a former appellate body, you know what those are. But the other idea you put forward in the book is this idea of a climate waiver. And I was wondering if you could explain, maybe not everyone is aware of what that concept is, what you are advocating in that. And then I have to ask you, a waiver under the WTO rules would require 3/4 acceptance by the ministerial conference or general council. That seems to bring up the taboo issue of voting. So I'm wondering, are members ready to go that far, even with the current climate crisis, to set aside one of the WTO taboos?
Well, ultimately, the aim in the waiver would be simply to have all the members of the WTO agree to it and not have a vote. We're a long way from that point. Let me Let me say that many people are sitting in the audience and they're thinking, he's advocating things for which there is no current support. I've been doing that all my life. I was the congressman from the Kennedy Space Center, much involved in the space program. We wanted to pass an appropriations bill to fund something called the International Space Station. I was a principal sponsor of that legislation. A few months before that vote, we were something like 120 votes behind. Ultimately, we won by 1 vote. I am a pretty tenacious little guy. And there are also a lot of other people working on these issues all over the world who are equally tenacious. So the fact that something is not immediately politically achievable means nothing to me in the context of these discussions. Let me outline what the options are for the members of the WTO if they wish to take these issues seriously, as an increasing number of them clearly do, and they wish to make some change. First of all, they can wait on the dispute settlement system to resolve some of the knottier disputes about the current rules on a case-by-case basis. Well, setting aside the fact, which we can return to later if the audience wishes, that we do not currently have an appellate body. As I've been saying since I said this to the General Counsel, I think in 2006, we do not need a collision between the trade and climate regimes. We do not need climate trade wars on top of everything else that's happening in the world. So just waiting on the jurists to decide is not a good option. Another option is to have legal interpretations and have the members come together and agree on a legal interpretation, which would require a 3/4 vote or consensus support. And here I think in some cases this is an option. For example, I have suggested in the book that the members adopt a legal interpretation saying that carbon taxes are eligible for the treatment provided for border tax adjustments in Article 2 of the GATT. But these interpretations only deal with the rules that are already in place. You can't interpret a rule that does not yet exist. So that's a limited option. The third option is to amend the rules. Well, if we don't have any support right now, we're sure not going to get the supermajority that's required to amend the rules right now, especially when we don't actually know exactly how we want to amend the rules. A fourth option is to do nothing. Well, those of us who think that these are urgent issues that we should have addressed years ago are not in favor of sitting around and doing nothing, nor I think at this point are most of the members of the WTO. So unless I've missed something, that leaves one option, and that is a waiver. A waiver is a way to address some of these issues temporarily until we get to the point where we want to amend the rules to address them through reforms permanently, which is always the goal of a waiver, and that's what's happened with some previous collective waivers. We've ended up amending the rules. So in my view, although at this point not one WTO member has advocated a climate waiver, I predict that within 5 years the WTO members will, unless they decide to do nothing and have the WTO drift into irrelevance, be working hard to approve a WTO climate waiver. Now, what would such a waiver be? Of course, that's ultimately open for discussion among the members, but here I've zeroed in on one particular issue I think we need to address, and that is the treatment of trade-related climate measures. Now, throughout the world, in furtherance of commitments made through nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement. That's another role I had in helping advise on how to construct that agreement. We're going to see countries enacting more and more climate measures, and we're very actively encouraging them to increase their climate ambition far beyond what they've already committed to do, because it's not nearly enough to do what needs to be done on climate. And as a practical political matter, in order to pass ambitious climate action in most of these countries, the politicians who are voting on these laws are going to have to do something about the apprehension that their domestic industries have about what's called carbon leakage. In terms of the industries themselves, they're fearful that more ambitious requirements will be imposed on them, but not their foreign competitors, and that therefore they will lack what they currently have in terms of competitiveness. Now, in some places, this is not much of a real concern. The empirical evidence so far suggests that these competitiveness fears relating to carbon leakage have been overstated. However, we're going to scale up climate ambition. And also, I'll tell you something from my own political experience, and I've never lost an election. In my experience, if the voters think something is real, then for political purposes, it's real, and you have to deal with it. So in order to pass much more ambitious climate action domestically, increasingly it's going to be necessary politically to couple that climate action for climate reasons with motivations relating to competitiveness reasons. Those of you who are steeped in the minutiae and esoterica of the GATT will know that this poses problems legally. If you have pure environmental motives in passing your climate action and you don't apply it in any way that results in arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on trade, then you're okay. It's perfectly fine under the WTO. But as it is, if there are mixed motives, both environmental and economic motives for the measure, then while Jennifer and Merritt and I could craft a measure for you that would probably thread the needle and get provisional justification under Article 20 of the GATT, we probably won't be asked to craft these measures. Instead, they'll be crafted by others who will feel the need, especially in order to pass the legislation, to showcase and highlight how this legislation will defend domestic economic interest. And that will make it hard to thread the full legal needle of the environmental defense that's provided under the GATT. So what I've said is, let's avoid this. One of the things that a climate waiver should do, and I get into particulars of my own proposal in the book, which I won't delve into in any depth here, is that we need to accept the fact in the trade community that the urgency of addressing climate change is so much that we need to be willing to accept as legal under WTO rules those trade-related climate measures that have mixed motivations. Now we can and should define them, and I've urged that the WTO and the COP work together to define them. I've written at length on this process and how we should go about it and what the contents should be. There's a chapter in the book on that. I've also written 3 papers that are online about that. I'll stop here now, but it seems to me that central to what the WTO must do is address this particular concern and thereby avoid the climate wars that will otherwise be forthcoming. Ms. Thornburg, it's very good to see you, my friend.
And Jim, just for those of you who haven't read the book yet, your climate waiver idea is pretty simple and straightforward, amazingly succinct, if I may read it out. You do write that to further carbon pricing and to facilitate the necessary transition to a decarbonized global economy, the core of the content of a WTO climate waiver should be a waiver from the application of WTO rules for trade restrictive national measures that, 3 points here, 1, discriminate based on the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases consumed or emitted in making a product. 2, fit the definition of a climate response measure as defined by the Climate Conference of the Parties, the COP. And 3, do not discriminate in a manner that constitutes a means of arbitrary or unjustified discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. Easy peasy.
Well, not really. As I go on to say, as simple as this may seem, there's some hurdles. For example, we have no global agreement on how to calculate the amount of carbon that's emitted in production. There was a very good conference here yesterday afternoon talking about that challenge. So at this point, there's been an effort by the COP for more than 2 decades to get agreement on the appropriate calculation metrics. It should be the COP and not the WTO that does this, but they haven't been able to get agreement. As a result, you have different countries proposing their own ways of doing things, and this can result in arbitrary and unjustifiable discrimination, I would predict. Domestically in my own region, where I'm helping lead a climate compact in a lot of action, independent and separate from governments, and especially our Ron DeSantis-led state government in Florida, we're simply going around them. We've had a difficulty in that, okay, which metrics are we going to use to calculate emissions? And this, I think, is true worldwide. There's another problem. I said that we need to abide by a process that provides the waiver to those measures that fit the definition of a climate response measure. At present, there is no definition of a climate response measure. The COP has never really grappled with the notion of a climate response measure in this context. They've really steered clear of dealing with the trade nexus, and it's been, as I said in one of my papers, a taboo in the COP. Well, it can't be anymore. We need to decide which measures are going to be entitled to the waiver and which are not, and we're not close to doing that. Well, this is a hard process, but nevertheless, as I've explained, I think ultimately it's the only process that has the prospect of succeeding. I'm not wed to the details of what I proposed, but I think this process needs to be pursued, and the sooner the better. Thank you, Dan, for spelling all that out.
Happy to do so. We will be taking questions from you because this is your event. It's not us. Are there any questions? June, can we take a few questions now and then maybe we'll go back?
That's a good idea.
Yeah?
We took 3 for now. I mean, we are now off the script completely.
That's fine.
If you will take 2 at a time, because I may not remember the third, or I may go off, as you could probably conclude by now, on some digression on the second and never get to the third. But I most enjoy this type of an exchange. I benefit the most from these question and answer sessions. So please proceed. If you would simply tell us who you are and where you're from, that would help me. And then heckle me or critique me or whatever you want to do.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jarosław Peters. I'm coming from Brussels. I have been negotiating services during Uruguay round, and but later have been involved in sustainability issues. My question is about complexity, because when I'm looking at carbon adjustment measures, I see how complex it becomes. And the complexity is something which may create difficulty on every front, including dispute settlements, including interpretation of the things. And then, so how to deal with the complexity issue by involving carbon adjustment measures, for example, into trade. There is plenty of space for circumvention. There is plenty of space for additional rules which will prevent this circumvention. So the complexity becomes a problem. Maybe just one addition, it's a paradox, because I thought the same about services, that service agreement and GATS will provoke plenty of disputes. Whereas when, and therefore I registered as a potential panelist for this dispute settlement, hoping that I will be frequently invited. But I've never have been invited because there has been only one case, I think, over the period of time. Mostly they relate to trade. Maybe it's therefore my worry about complexity, like it is complexity with services, it's not really warranted. It's not really some based.
This first round?
You've been stunned into silence by Jim.
There's someone back there.
Hi, I'm Joshua Wickerham from the ISEAL Alliance, or the Global Association of Sustainability Standards. I believe that ISEAL code-compliant members meet WTO disciplines and principles. Is the lack of an appellate body a good time? Does it mean it's a good time for governments to set high domestic regulations and grab the opportunity to use voluntary measures as means of implementing similar environmental requirements in trade? What would be the implications of that?
First of all, I've not confronted a WTO question, a WTO dispute that was not complex. They're all complex and in different ways. I spent one thoroughly enjoyable and complex summer here in, I think it was 1997, dealing with something called the bananas dispute, which, believe it or not, was the first services case. So they're all complex. And these disputes relating to climate measures that affect trade will be complex. There's no question about it. As you probably noted, I've suggested that in terms of a lot of the aspects of these issues, that there needs to be action outside the WTO. It's the COP that ought to establish the standard of gauging the amount of emissions. It's the COP that ought to define a climate response measure. I think there should be consultation with the WTO and all of this, but I think it's for the COP to make these decisions. However, we have a situation in which, despite my own recommendations, and that of some others who were on the high-level advisory panel trying to assist the COP at the time, they did not include a dispute settlement system in the Paris Agreement. This does not mean that there's not dispute settlement arising from the agreement. It means that for the 165 members of the COP, who are also members of the WTO, where their climate measures affect trade, the WTO is going to have jurisdiction. I mean, that's really where we are in the world. So trade judges are now about to become climate judges. And I've explained that one reason why I think we need a waiver is that we shouldn't be relying entirely on trade judges to make climate decisions, although I have a lot of confidence in trade judges to do the right thing. And this relates to the second question. Let me first acknowledge the presence of Peter Vanden Bosch, my former colleague and former chair of the appellate body of the WTO. They're all here to see that I don't break the bonds of the WTO rules of conduct by telling all of you too much. And please tell my American friends, there are rules, and the appellate body adopted them before the members did, and has dealt with and has abided by them all along. You ask about the absence of an appellate body. I don't discuss this issue in the book. It's about substance and not process. But if any of you have ventured online to read some of the things I've written on the current situation of dispute settlement, or have heard some of my venting in various appearances that are on YouTube and elsewhere, you know that I think we have a dire situation in dispute settlement. In case you're wondering, I think my own country is completely wrong on this issue and engaged in propagating what I consider to be one more big lie in terms of the actions of the appellate body. It's past time for my country to wake up and realize that we cannot have a world trading system in which the United States expects other countries to comply with the rules, and that a dispute settlement system enforce those rules against other countries without expecting that we Americans would do the same. And that's what's happening here, despite the rhetoric that you hear. We can dispute whether any particular outcome, any particular decision by the appellate body has been right or wrong. That's fair game. That's often done in dispute settlement. A country that does not prevail in a dispute is not going to be happy about it. And nevertheless, that's true in jurisprudence all over the planet. It's true in courts all over the world. What the United States is saying, however, is something different. They're saying that the members of the appellate body have gone beyond their legal authority under the dispute settlement treaty, gone off the reservation, legally, so to speak, and engaged in making judgments that it should never have made on various issues. And this is simply 100% incorrect. The appellate body has done the job it's been asked to do by the members of the WTO, and it's done so in the way in which the members have instructed the appellate body to do so, by applying the customary rules of interpretation of public international law. The appellate body is no more perfect than any other judicial tribunal in the world. I would, however, argue that the appellate body has come a great deal closer to perfection than has the Supreme Court of the United States, especially in the years since its wrong-headed ruling in Bush v. Gore. It's been downhill ever since. But we Americans who disagree with those rulings are not calling for the abolition of the United States Supreme Court. And what the United States has done on a single-minded fashion has bullied the other members of the WTO to the point where we have no appellate body. And we've returned to the days of the GATT when any one country could block the adoption of a panel ruling. This is why we created the dispute settlement system in the 1990s, so that that can no longer happen. But that's exactly what's happening now, because members have a right under the treaty to appeal a panel ruling, yet when they exercise that right now, they appeal to nowhere. But the dispute settlement body, as a consequence, cannot adopt these rulings because these members have been denied their treaty right to an appeal. And so you have the United States appealing these cases, knowing there's no appellate body to rule on them. What hypocrisy. As you can see, I have strong feelings on this. One of my fears is that the other members of the WTO who almost entirely do not agree with the United States on these issues relating to the appellate body, will nevertheless become so desperate to get the United States fully engaged once more in the WTO in an affirmative way that they will concede certain fundamental issues to the United States in reconstituting some form of an appellate body. What the United States wants is basically the right to veto on a singular fashion WTO rulings. That's what they want. The reason why they haven't made any specific proposals is that what they want is so embarrassing that they are unwilling to say it out loud. But that's what they want. And at this point, they would be happy to achieve this by indirection if other members agreed to reduce the independence and the impartiality of the appellate body. If that is done, if other members make this concession, then the WTO is doomed, because the appellate body will be judged to be a political court. The dispute settlement process will be adjudged to be entirely political. The credibility of the dispute settlement system will be undermined, and it's the credibility of the dispute settlement system that holds the entire trading system together. It is the glue that binds the multilateral trading system. So I would say to other members of the WTO, stand up to the Americans. Don't lie down. Insist on the importance of continuing with the international rule of law. And if the Americans don't want to participate, then there's one more chair for someone else to occupy in the room. I perhaps should have written that chapter in the book. But
I'm going to steal your microphone away from you and switch the subject. Back to the book. I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of climate justice. You are advocating for an agreement on carbon pricing. You are favorable to the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism from your book, as I read it. Correct me if I'm wrong. How do you establish such a system while addressing those who say, why should we do this? Why are we being asked to pay for this? We did not contribute to the problem we're facing today, and I'm talking about the developing world, least developed countries. We've seen the tragedy in Pakistan with the flooding there, and we've seen officials in Pakistan talking about climate reparations. We've most recently seen Denmark, for example, being one of the first developed countries, the first, I believe, to say we're going to give money to fix the wrong that has happened historically. How do you address this issue within the context of making the WTO more effective in addressing climate change?
That's a critical question, Dan. Let me first of all address it in the context of the WTO, and then I'll address it more broadly in terms of what we're hoping to see at the upcoming COP in Egypt toward the end of this year. I have a paper that I'm writing now on this very issue, and let me just tell you what I'll be saying in the paper at greater length than with footnotes. The notion that developed countries have of scaling up climate action, and in doing so of imposing various carbon border adjustment measures is something that I support in principle for the reasons I outlined before. My proposal for a climate waiver would accommodate those kinds of measures. They might be imposed by any country in the world, but at the outset, initially, they're most likely to be imposed by developed countries. What I did not discuss enough in the book, in my view, is the effects of these kinds of measures on developing countries, because that's who's going to bear the burden. And what I've been saying since the was published when asked about this is that I think that whenever these measures are contemplated by developed countries, they need to be accompanied by a whole array of actions that would assist and enable developing countries in complying with these obligations. At the top of the list would be money. On the list also would be, for example, with respect to the proposed European CBAM, consultations, full consultations now with the affected countries on the potential administrative and other costs they will incur as a consequence of these measures. Efforts must be made to diminish these costs as much as possible. Otherwise, in my view, there's a violation of Article 11. And in the absence of a climate waiver, I don't see how the European measure could thread that Article 20 needle. Also, many countries, developing countries, simply don't have the capacity to, whether in terms of human capital or technology or the infrastructure on the ground, to comply with these measures. How are they going to calculate their emissions if we don't know how to do so in the United States? And we're not even in agreement in the United States on how to do it. So how can we expect, say, Paraguay to do it without any assistance? This must be a part of what's proposed through these measures, because in effect, at least in the near term, these kinds of measures will be impositions on the trade of the developing world. So there, I think we need to look, say, to the trade facilitation agreement, where there are periods of adjustment where there is money that's provided, not enough, and where there's technical assistance, and not simply announce these measures and explain what we're going to do without even consulting with those who are affected by it. I think that leads to multiple WTO violations. It's arbitrary and unjustifiable. Now, beyond the WTO, we have the wider world of the COP and our efforts to deal with the issues such as loss and damage. And here it's my view that my country, the European Union, Japan, and others have promised too little, much too little, and the facts are we haven't kept the few promises we've made. Back in Copenhagen in 2009, developing countries were promised $100 billion a year, starting in 2020, to be able to adapt to climate change and try to mitigate it if they can, and deal with these what we now call loss and damage kinds of issues. Climate justice, that's the perfect phrase. Well, where is that money? It's not been forthcoming apart from just a few billion. President Obama set aside several billion for this. President Trump made most of it go away. The United States is now back in the game of trying to fulfill some of its responsibilities in the broader world, but even the Biden administration has not done remotely enough on this issue. The fact is, the developing world did not cause this problem. And the fact is that many smaller countries, especially island countries and coastal countries, are bearing the brunt of it here as climate change accelerates. This is unjust. And they shouldn't be begging for billions. They should be getting trillions of dollars from the developed countries of the world. That needs to happen, or we're not going to be able to deal with this. Now, let me say something else in terms of the planet. There is this ongoing debate, and I've been engaged in it for more than 30 years now between developed and developing countries about the responsibility for addressing climate change. And here we are, we're in a world where, without doubt, developed countries cause this problem. In my view, the developed world is committed two profound injustices on developing countries, one intentional and one unintentional, but it's guilty of both. The first is, of course, colonization. The second is the fact, that's the one that was intentional. The second is unintentional as an injustice, and that is the fact that in colonizing much of the developing world, the developed countries brought them into a civilization based on carbon and fossil fuels. It was a choice the developed countries made, and that other countries were then brought into embracing. So those are two injustices. And as I've just said, I think it falls upon developed countries to do vastly more than they're doing now to deal with this global issue. However, I've listened to some people from developing countries who have told me, well, it's only just if now that the developed world has had the chance to develop while relying on fossil fuels, we have the chance to do the same. I'm sorry, but that's not what the human species should be doing. We are one species, we have one planet, and we better get our act together and realize that we're all in this together. And whatever past injustices have occurred, the only just thing for all the people in the world together is if we now work together urgently to resolve these issues. We will not be able to address climate change as we should unless developing countries are also fully engaged. And I'm speaking to you, India, China, and other larger developing countries, especially because you're increasing sources of carbon emissions. You cannot be excused from this action because of the past actions I just described. We're only going to be able to do this if the larger emitters in the world work together. There are maybe a dozen countries that are responsible for the vast majority of emissions. And they have to work together, whatever their geopolitical differences, whatever the other events in the world may be, and we need to do it right now. Because what I'm interested in is global justice for everyone. And that can only happen if we address climate change and biodiversity loss and these other ecological and ecosystem issues now and together.
Time flies when you're engaged in a stimulating conversation. We only have 15 minutes left. Wow. June, with your permission, should we open the floor again to a couple more questions?
Please,
yeah, do that? Yes. Why don't I give you my microphone?
Just again, tell us who you are, where you're from.
Sure. Hi, I'm Melanie Foley with Public Citizen. So the WTO was recently discussing another waiver, the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines, which took almost 2 years to agree to a very watered down version of it that public health experts called too little too late. What do you think needs to change at the WTO in order to get a meaningful climate waiver in time to get the WTO out of the way so countries can help us avoid the worst of climate change?
Thank you. The issue you described was another complex issue, and there's no question that taking 2 years was a year or so too long. And I've written widely, and I write in the book about the problems of vaccine nationalism. I won't repeat all that here today. You're perfectly free to read the book. Lori Wallach and I have had some disagreements through the years, but I think she'd agree with much of what I say there. Give her my regards. This is a very real question. As I said, I think it's going to be several years before the members get around in their usual way of confronting the need for a climate waiver. So we have that challenge now. I think this is an issue on which Public Citizen and I will largely agree. We have that challenge now of accelerating that process. And one of the things that I'm trying to do while I'm here in Geneva and elsewhere, in working with a number of developmental institutes and NGOs worldwide now, is to try to encourage them to first applaud WTO members for now beginning to address these issues through discussions, but also encourage them to move much more quickly. Where we are now, the members are talking only about discussions. There are needless debates about whether they're doing so within the WTO framework or not that I think are petty and pointless. But what you have is a very highly motivated group of delegates who don't have to be persuaded of the need for the WTO to do these things. But they don't feel that they're at the point where there can be discussions about actual negotiations, much less rulemaking. So part of what I'm trying to do is help accelerate that process by working with them to the extent that they feel they need my participation and counsel. These days I'm pro bono counsel to the world, if the world wants me. But I think we have to accelerate this process. I think your premise is exactly correct.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, in the back. I'll give you my mic. Or my colleague.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Professor Bacchus. Joachim Hoefbach from the World Economic Forum, where I work at the nexus of trade, investment, and climate change. So we've heard the word complexity a few times being used, especially when you look at the linkages between trade and environment, trade and climate change. And if something is very complex, you need to look at it with a group of people, right? You need to look at something with, from different perspectives. And if you want to look at trade and climate change from different perspectives, at least the trade and climate perspective should be there together. And I think one of the biggest challenges when we address trade and climate change issues and the complexity being there is that we need to bring the climate and the trade communities together. But that's very difficult. It's even very difficult at the domestic level to bring trade and climate ministers together. So I think this is also an issue of communication. There's also fragmentation at the global level. The biggest countries in the world don't get along very well at the moment, as we all know. So how, and also with your journalism background, how can we improve communication channels between the different communities? How can we elevate the level of understanding with global leaders? And how can global leaders communicate those issues to the population to address this complexity, to break it down and to make things a bit simpler so that we can take action? Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim, and let me congratulate you and the World Economic Forum on the work you're doing on this nexus between trade and climate change. It's another positive effort, in my view, among many by the WEF. I have the pleasure of often being the climate person in the trade meetings and the trade person in the climate meetings. As June Young mentioned at the outset, although I wear WTO on my forehead in the world, I've actually been involved in working for sustainable development longer than I've been involved in trade. And at this point, I've been involved in trade a long time. But I began working in Florida for sustainable development in the state government soon after the Stockholm Declaration, when I was in my early 20s. And then when I came to the Congress, I came at a time when James Hansen had just testified before the Science Committee about climate change. And I was on the Science Committee. So as I described earlier, I began working on a lot of these environmental and climate issues. And in trade, of course, we've been contributing to the social and economic goals of sustainable development. Trade has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty worldwide. The gains from trade have not, in my view, been fairly shared in much of the world. That's another issue we can talk about. But the key word here in your question is complexity. And my concern is that, by the way, don't worry, I once gave a speech in Vero Beach to 3 people in the back corner booth of a Burger King. So I'm indifferent to surrounding noise. The problem is that in our politics nowadays, we don't have room for complexity. We don't have room for nuance. We have politicians in both parties in my country who are most interested in tweeting about something and considerably less interested in legislating about anything. And then we have a structure in which the center isn't holding because the center is not to be found in our Congress. It's been gerrymandered out of representation. So you have people talking to each other who are not really talking to each other, they're talking past each other. And they're not even trying to find common ground. I think I was probably sent over here by my country on a bipartisan basis because I was known in the Congress as someone who sought common ground. And I'm very proud that in the 60 appeals that I judged, while I was here, we reached a consensus in every appeal. It's not by accident. There's not much effort in the world now to try to do that, even on a multilateral basis. There are too many efforts simply to make points politically, and no one, that's an overstatement, the vast majority of our political leaders in the world are unwilling to make anything that can be conceived as some type of a political concession back home in order to advance the overall cause that is at issue. And this includes trade and includes climate change. You see the Biden administration now and its non-trade trade policy, they're phrasing it as if it's some kind of a new approach to trade. And I certainly share their environmental and labor goals. But other than that, it's basically the Trump policy with all the insults. And the truth of the matter is, it's shaped by the fact that they do not have the guts politically to propose anything to the Congress that would lower a barrier to trade, a tariff or some other form of trade barrier to another country. So here we are with this new economic framework we're talking about in the Asia-Pacific, where quite rightly, in my view, the United States is seeking higher labor and environmental standards. But if you're one of the Asia-Pacific countries negotiating with the United States, you might ask the Americans, well, you want us to accept these higher labor and environmental standards. What are you giving us in return? They want market access. But market access is nothing that the United States is willing to make a part of this agreement. We can argue that these countries should be choosing to impose these higher standards on their own. But they have domestic considerations politically that keep them from doing so even when they wish to do so. So they have to show their domestic producers they got something in return. And we, the United States, are not offering them that in this particular framework. I would also argue that these particular issues should be negotiated within the WTO and not outside the WTO. But that's a talk for another day.
Thank you very much. We are nearly ending. One takeaway for me personally is your can-do spirit. It's something that I really cherish myself. I feel like it was our lifetime opportunity to hear your very candid voices, authorities, whether everybody will agree with you or not. That's a different story, right, Jim? But this was a great opportunity for us to hear you. We are very grateful to you. Maybe I want to ask you a final word. What do you want this audience to take from your book, Trade Links? What should we do for our role in some way in trade community or environment community to fulfill the climate ambition and climate justice? What would you like us to do more?
I would urge everyone here to keep in mind the basic thesis of my book, which is that it's not enough for trade rules not to stand in the way of sustainable development. Trade rules must be reimagined, they must be implemented, and they must be enforced in ways that actively and affirmatively advance sustainable development. And with that in mind, I think on every particular issue, many of which I've addressed in the book, there are specific proposals, some from me, some from others, that will enable us to give that type of affirmative agency to the WTO, an agency that those of us who created the WTO set out as our purpose in the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement. Thank you all so very much for your time and your attention. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bacchus. Thank you, June. Thank you, Dan. So the book would be available here now if you want to purchase a copy and be signed by Professor Bacchus. It's also available at the bookshop and also for circulation at the WTO library. And we will see you tomorrow, same time, for the commentary on world trade law. Thank you very much.